The record of terror begins not with triumph, but with ruin. The throne world, once radiant as the heart of human civilization, became a corpse dressed in gold. Across the marble streets, meant for the parades of victory, ran rivers of blood. The skies were black with smoke, the ruins echoing with prayers unanswered. At the center of this desolation sat the Emperor of mankind, no longer a conqueror striding among the stars, but a broken figure bound forever to the Galdan throne. To those who survived the final days, he seemed less a man than a dying god, chained to a machine that devoured his life with every passing moment. It had not always been so. Once, the Imperium had stretched across the galaxy, vast beyond comprehension. Under the banner of the Great Crusade, billions marched, millions died, and worlds fell in awe or in ashes. The Emperor had promised unity, reason, and a future free from the madness of superstition. His words were iron, his armies relentless, and his vision seemed unstoppable. Humanity believed it was rising toward a golden dawn, but even the brightest dawn casts shadows. The Imperium's victories were written in fire, its unity was enforced with blood, and at its heart stood not merely armies, but the Primarchs' 20 superhuman sons, each forged as living weapons, generals and rulers of worlds. Among them was one who shone brighter than all others, Horus Lupercal. Horus was the first of the Primarchs to be found, the most beloved and the most trusted. Where others were cold, brutal or strange, Horus was charismatic, brilliant, and loyal. To his brothers, he was a leader. To the legions, he was a hero. To the Emperor, he was more than a son, he was the favored child. The Warmaster chosen to carry the weight of empire upon his shoulders. No other figure stood so close to the throne, no other name carried such glory. And yet, it was his name that would be cursed for 10,000 years. Horus, the Chosen One, became the architect of the greatest betrayal in human history. The war that bears his name, the Horus Heresy, was not a simple clash of good and evil, but a tragedy of cosmic scale. Some say he was deceived, ensnared by the whispers of the Chaos Gods, whose lies turned his heart against his father. Others claim that he saw the truth, the hidden face of the Emperor, the lies upon which the Imperium was built, and the chains he had fastened upon humanity. Thus we are left with a question that time cannot answer. Did Horus betray because he was deceived, or because he truly saw the darkness in his father? The truth may never be known. What survives are fragments, records, legends, memories distorted by faith and fear. The Horus Heresy lingers not as a tale of heroes and villains, but as a wound that never healed. It is a tragedy written in blood, a history that offers no certainty. To some, Horus was the greatest traitor who ever lived. To others, he was the only son who dared to speak the truth. What is certain is this: the galaxy that we inherit was shaped not by triumph, but by betrayal. The Imperium endures, yes, but it endures as a shell, propped up by faith, violence, and silence. And the question remains, echoing across 10 millennia of war: was Horus the victim of lies, or the herald of truth? For in this universe, there are no simple answers, only tragedy. To seek that answer, we must turn back to the beginning. At the dawn of the Great Crusade, when mankind was still scattered across countless stars, the Emperor discovered the very first of his lost sons among the Primarchs. That son bore the name Horus. Unlike his brothers, Horus was not merely found early, he grew at his father's side for many years, absorbing the lessons, the guidance, and the quiet authority of the Emperor himself. This forged a bond unmatched by any other Primarch. To Horus, the Emperor was more than creator, more than sovereign. He was the one and only father, the ultimate figure to be revered. To the Emperor, Horus was not only the perfect instrument of war, but also a symbol of hope, a trusted right hand, and the very embodiment of mankind's future. Chroniclers of the age recall Horus burning like a star against the void of disorder. Wherever he marched, he was a blazing fire upon the battlefield, a towering figure whose stance radiated command, whose eyes held the fire of resolve, and whose voice could rouse the spirits of 10,000 warriors at once. Soldiers did not follow him merely out of duty. They followed out of love, admiration, and unwavering faith. Horus possessed the aura of a natural leader, at once brother, father, and comrade to all under his command. His presence alone was enough to inspire courage in the hearts of the timid and strengthen the hearts of the bold. To those who beheld him, he was nothing less than the son of the Great Crusade, the beacon lighting the way for all humanity. The bond of father and son between Horus and the Emperor transcended the realm of mortal understanding. On each campaign, Horus would seek the gaze of his father, looking for guidance, reassurance, and affirmation. The Emperor in return would lay his hand upon Horus's broad shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both trust and boundless confidence. This silent communication spoke louder than words ever could, and it cemented the unbreakable unity between them. Father and son moved as one will, and the shared purpose of their hearts echoed across the stars. Even the other Primarchs felt the weight of Horus's favor with the Emperor. Some looked on with envy, others with admiration, but all acknowledged the unique destiny of the firstborn son. He was a living embodiment of the Emperor's vision, the bridge between godlike authority and mortal struggle, a paragon of courage and wisdom. In the eyes of the legions, Horus was more than a commander. He was the living legend of what the Great Crusade could achieve when led by one chosen by fate itself. And yet, even amid such glory, there was a subtle gravity to Horus. Chroniclers note the quiet moments, when he would stand alone on the deck of a battle barge or look out across the expanse of a conquered world. In those fleeting moments, he bore the weight of responsibility that came with being the first and favored son. His triumphs were not merely his own, they carried the hopes, the dreams, and the burdens of entire legions and the Emperor himself. The destiny that had brought him to this place of honor was also a mantle of inexorable expectation, one that would shape every choice he made in the years to come. At the dawn of the age, the fate of humanity seemed intertwined with a bond between Horus and the Emperor. Their unity, their shared vision, and their unshakable trust appeared to promise a future of conquest and enlightenment across the stars. Many a historian would later remark that the Great Crusade's victories were not solely the work of armies and fleets, but of this singular, luminous bond of father and his chosen son, moving together as one, heralding an era that, at the time, seemed destined to last for eternity. When the Emperor withdrew to secret projects upon Dare, the mantle of command over the Great Crusade was entrusted entirely to Horus. The title of Warmaster was not merely ceremonial, it was the weight of an empire laid upon his broad shoulders. Every legion, every ship, and every battle now fell under his vigilance. The ceremonies that conferred this honor were monumental ships adorned with banners of flame, the roar of artillery echoing across orbital platforms, and the eyes of countless Astartes fixed upon him in unwavering loyalty. Horus felt the thrill of triumph, yet beneath it lay a shadow of responsibility so immense that few could comprehend it. He was no longer simply the favored son. He was the living embodiment of the Emperor's will across the galaxy. Each decision he made would ripple through the legions, affect the fate of worlds, and shape the destiny of humanity itself. Chroniclers would later write that in those moments, Horus stood taller than any man or Primarch before him, not merely as a commander, but as the beating heart of the Great Crusade. On the battlefields, Horus displayed a brilliance unmatched. He orchestrated campaigns with strategic foresight, predicting enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. His presence alone inspired his Astartes, forging them into instruments of precision and overwhelming force. But his genius was tempered by empathy. He understood the fears, doubts, and aspirations of his warriors, and he led not merely with authority, but with the bond of trust and respect. Every legionnaire who followed Horus believed in him as much as they believed in the Emperor himself. Yet, even amid glory, the weight of command bore down relentlessly. Horus often stood alone upon the deck of his flagship, gazing upon the swirling void, contemplating the lives under his charge. Every conquered world, every fire fort, every decision to spare or destroy bore the mark of his judgment. The burden was both a crown and a yoke, a duality that few could endure. Even the Primarchs who envied his favor with the Emperor whispered in private of the heavy toll it exacted. The sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the unyielding expectation to be perfect in every action. The legions hailed him as a hero, but Horus knew that heroism was never without cost. Each victory demanded sacrifice. Each decision could bring ruin. The Emperor's trust was absolute, but it brought with it a pressure that no mortal or demigod could dismiss lightly. Chroniclers speak of the silent hours before battle, when Horus walked among the banners of his legions, not as a figure of inspiration alone, but as one who bore the crushing weight of destiny itself. And yet, even as he rose to heights unmatched by any of his brothers, the seeds of doubt and shadow began to take root. In the quiet moments, he pondered the isolation of his command, the distance growing between him and the Emperor. The immense honor of Warmaster was inseparable from immense responsibility, and that responsibility carried with it the subtle whisper of loneliness that would one day be exploited. But in that age, these were mere shadows upon a shining figure. Horus was at the pinnacle of human achievement, a hero beyond compare, the living embodiment of the Great Crusade, carrying both the glory and the burdens of an empire. Horus, Warmaster of the Great Crusade, had never known a life without purpose. Yet purpose alone could not shield him from the shadows creeping into his mind. When the Emperor withdrew to Dira to pursue the secret Webway project, Horus felt a void where once there had been guidance and companionship. The presence of his father, the one constant in the storm of war, became distant, almost spectral. In the silent expanse of command, amidst fleets that stretched across light years and legions whose loyalty never wavered, he sensed the first pangs of isolation. He was surrounded by thousands of Astartes, yet he stood alone, burdened not only with the responsibility of victory, but with the gnawing sense of being left behind. It was not merely physical absence that gnawed at him. The Emperor's retreat was shrouded in secrecy, and rumors of strange projects whispered through the corridors of power. Horus, who had always admired and trusted his father without question, found himself pondering matters previously unthinkable. Why must the Emperor abandon direct oversight of the crusade? What was hidden in the silent halls of Da-vin? And above all, was Horus truly needed, or had his father already decided the fates of men and worlds without him? These questions, small at first, festered into doubt. Even among the Primarchs, tensions began to surface. Patura, meticulous and suspicious by nature, questioned the strategic decisions of Horus, often suggesting alternative methods that, while effective, implied a lack of absolute certainty in Horus's judgment. Russ, blunt and fiercely proud, challenged the assumptions underlying the campaigns, offering a perspective that bordered on insubordination. Lorgar, ever contemplative, seemed to drift between reverence and quiet discontent, hinting at philosophical divergences that others did not yet see. The chorus of dissent, subtle as it was, formed a backdrop against which Horus's sense of unity and absolute authority began to fray. Each disagreement, each hesitant suggestion, carved tiny fissures in the armor of his mind, revealing the first cracks in a will once thought unassailable. Into these cracks slithered the subtle manipulations of chaos. The whispers were not loud. They were almost imperceptible, woven into dreams, idle moments, and the quiet reflection after victory. They told him truths shaped to his pride, that Primarchs were tools, instruments to serve a vision they could not fully comprehend, that the Emperor in his secrecy viewed them as mere extensions of his will rather than as sons, warriors, or men, that the loyalty of the legions, though true, was owed to Horus's position and not to him personally. Each whisper, seemingly casual, gnawed at the edges of Horus's confidence, urging him to consider the possibility that his greatness might be more his own than he had ever imagined. The psychological tension within Horus was profound. Loyalty to the Emperor battled an emergent desire to assert his own judgment, to test the bounds of authority and destiny. He questioned whether unwavering obedience was truly service, or merely submission to a plan whose contours he could never see. Every campaign, every decision, was now measured not only against the immediate necessities of war, but against the gnawing awareness of secrets and omissions. Was the glory of the crusade a true reflection of human potential, or a meticulously orchestrated show, with Horus and his brothers as performers rather than actors of their own fate? The fissures were not apparent to those around him. To the legions, Horus remained the embodiment of the Emperor's will, heroic, brilliant, unflinching. To the Primarchs he remained a figure of awe, commanding with certainty even when the weight of doubt pressed inward. Yet within his mind, a subtle fracture was forming, shaped by isolation, by the absence of the Emperor and by the first tendrils of doubt sown by unseen powers. Even victories brought no comfort. Each triumph was measured against the distance growing between father and son, between duty and desire. In quiet reflection, Horus began to glimpse a gulf that might never be bridged, the gulf between absolute loyalty and the yearning to define his own path. Thus, the first shadows fell upon the mind of Horus the Warmaster, whose name echoed across the stars as the herald of the Great Crusade, began to feel the stirrings of uncertainty, a subtle fracture that chaos would later exploit. He remained brilliant, decisive and revered, yet beneath the shining armor of achievement, the seeds of doubt had taken root. Loyalty and pride, obedience and ambition, honor, and the desire for autonomy, they swirled within him in a storm that none could calm. And in that storm, the tragedy of Horus began to unfold, quietly, invisibly, yet inevitably, setting the stage for betrayal that would shake the galaxy to its core. The distance between father and son grew wider with each passing campaign. On Da-vin, the Emperor poured his brilliance into the Webway project, a venture so secret that even the Warmaster was left in ignorance. For Horus, this secrecy was not merely a matter of withheld knowledge, it was a wound, cutting into the bond that had once been unbreakable. To be entrusted with the command of the galaxy-spanning crusade and yet excluded from the most vital undertaking of his father's reign was a contradiction he could not reconcile. The honor of leadership now tasted bitter, mingled with the suspicion that he had been elevated not as a partner but as a substitute. Isolation deepened as his brothers pursued their own paths. Petura, consumed by envy and calculation, viewed Horus's exalted position as a reminder of his own lack of recognition. Rus, loyal yet prideful, challenged him openly, framing dissent as honesty. Lorga, bruised by the Emperor's condemnation of faith, turned to whispers of divinity, finding in Horus not a leader but a potential ally in unspoken rebellion. Each interaction pressed upon Horus the sense that he was no longer a unifying figure among the Primarchs, but rather a fulcrum upon which resentments, doubts, and rival visions balanced precariously. The legions themselves reflected this tension. Captains whispered of politics behind closed doors, wondering why the Emperor had retreated, debating whether the crusade was truly a mission of enlightenment or an empire forged by conquest. Horus, listening in silence, could not ignore these murmurs, though his outward presence silenced dissent. Inwardly, the questions resonated with his own uncertainties. Was the Imperium truly a promise of freedom, or a cage built on obedience and blood? The whispers of chaos took advantage of this atmosphere, seeding themselves not as lies but as possibilities. They did not scream treachery, they suggested perspective. "You are more than a tool," they whispered, "more than a son to be abandoned when no longer useful. You are the future of mankind." These words, echoing in dreams and in fleeting thoughts, appealed to the core of Horus's pride. For a Primarch forged as the exemplar of humanity, the idea that he might surpass even the Emperor was intoxicating. It was not rebellion that first stirred in his heart, but the yearning to be recognized as equal, as indispensable. The paradox gnawed at him: to be utterly loyal, yet increasingly doubtful; to be beloved yet deeply alone; to be exalted yet excluded. His victories, once sources of joy, became reminders of his father's absence. Every triumph seemed hollow, for the one he most longed to impress no longer stood beside him. The grandeur of banners, the cheers of legions, the galaxies brought into compliance, none of it could replace the simple presence of the Emperor at his side. This psychological fracture was invisible to most. To the legions, Horus still appeared flawless, a warrior of radiant charisma, a commander whose genius was unmatched. But to himself, he was a man caught between devotion and disillusion. The seeds of tragedy were not born from hatred, but from love strained by absence, loyalty eroded by secrecy, and ambition sharpened by doubt. Had the Emperor shared his vision, had he spoken plainly of the webway and its promise, perhaps the fracture might have healed. Instead, silence deepened the wound, and into that silence, the voices of chaos grew louder. They spoke of futures where mankind was enslaved beneath a god's throne, and of alternatives where Horus could lead free men to destiny unchained. They gave form to thoughts he dared not confess, making the unthinkable plausible, then tempting, and finally inevitable. Thus the Vietenti within Horus became more than a crack. It became a fault line, invisible yet ready to shatter under pressure. The Warmaster, brightest of the Primarchs, remained loyal in word and deed, yet in his soul he had begun to drift. The tragedy of Horus was not a sudden fall but a gradual surrender, one whisper at a time, until doubt became conviction and conviction became the path to ruin. As shadows of doubt deepened within Horus, the Warmaster's mind became fertile ground for darker influences. The cracks born of isolation and whispered deceptions had set the stage for a turning point that would forever alter the fate of the Imperium. Across the stars, the campaign at Da-vin loomed, a mission that promised glory, yet would bring grievous injury, and with it, the first tangible step toward betrayal. What had begun as subtle unease now demanded confrontation with destiny itself. For there, in the fires of Da-vin, the fragile loyalty of Horus would be tested, shattered, and reforged in the unholy light of chaos. The Da-vin system loomed as a harsh and unyielding world, its gray skies choked with ash, its plains scarred by centuries of winds and volcanic upheaval. From the command deck of his flagship, Horus, the Warmaster, observed the legions arrayed below him. Each Astarte moved with precision, a tide of silver and gold, ready to heed the slightest signal. Yet even amidst this orchestrated perfection, a shadow flickered across his mind. The victories of the Great Crusade had built his legend, but here, on this remote and merciless planet, the limits of flesh, of command, and of trust were made starkly apparent. Landing parties descended upon the fractured plains, and the Warmaster personally led the initial assault. Horus's tactics were flawless in conception. Every strike, every maneuver, every feint was executed with surgical precision. His charisma and authority inspired awe, yet subtle frustrations gnawed at him. The Emperor, who had entrusted him with the mantle of the crusade, remained distant, absorbed in secret works upon Da-vin. The bond that had once been as tangible as armor and steel now seemed fragile, stretched thin across light years. Horus felt a pang of isolation that no legion, however loyal, could assuage. The battle erupted with the fury of a storm made manifest. Dropships cut through the clouds like silver knives, and artillery thundered across the plains, shaking the ground beneath the Warmaster's feet. The legions fought with the disciplined ferocity of warriors trained to die, yet the enemy had anticipated their arrival. A sudden ambush, executed with cunning precision, left Horus exposed. Plasma fire tore into his armor, and fragments of debris slashed across his limbs. The Warmaster, normally the axis around which the galaxy's armies revolved, now tasted vulnerability. For the first time, flesh, not steel or strategy, betrayed him. Horus was carried from the battlefield by his aides, his body broken, but his mind alight with turmoil. Around him the clash of war faded into a distant echo, a storm that raged on though he could no longer command its course. Suspended between agony and silence, he felt time fracture, each breath pulling him further from the certainty he once embodied. The legions, sensing the peril of their commander, rallied with desperate valor, yet the Warmaster's own doubts were now tangible. He had long measured loyalty in deeds, in obedience, in the unquestioning faith of his Astartes, but here, in the quiet moments between consciousness and pain, he realized the gulf between action and recognition. The Emperor's absence was more than physical. It was a chasm within the soul, a space that doubt and suspicion began to occupy. As medics attended to his wounds, Horus reflected on the fragility of triumph. Victory could be achieved, banners could be raised, worlds could fall, but what of the approval of the one whose judgment had once defined him? The victories of the Crusade now seemed distant echoes, hollow without the gaze of his father. The Emperor, pain, survival, and the whisper of possibility converged, creating a fertile ground for the seeds of doubt to take root. Thus, Da-vin became more than a battlefield. It was a crucible for the Warmaster's spirit. Here, amidst shattered plains and the cries of combat, Horus confronted his limits, his loyalty, and the first stirrings of a question that had never dared form fully in his mind. Could the path of obedience and filial duty truly be aligned with the welfare of humanity? Carried from the shattered plains by his aides, Horus's body survived, but his mind teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Beyond the battlefield, hidden from the eyes of the legions, the Serpent Lodge awaited a crucible where whispers of destiny and visions of liberation would converge, and where the first tangible threads of rebellion would be woven into the Warmaster's soul. The chaos of Da-vin's battlefield did not end with his wounds. It followed Horus inward, shaping the doubts that had long lingered in the Warmaster's soul. Carried from the shattered plains by his aides, his body broken, but his mind aflame with uncertainty, he was delivered to the Serpent Lodge, a hidden sanctum where whispers of destiny and visions of liberation would converge, and where the first tangible threads of rebellion would be woven. The halls of the lodge were suffused with shadow, each corridor lined with arcane symbols that shimmered with a light no mortal eye could fully comprehend. The priests of chaos moved with deliberate precision, their chants curling through the air like serpents of sound. The rituals were subtle, almost imperceptible, but each note and gesture was designed to touch Horus's mind at the deepest level. Healing his body was only a part of their purpose. The true objective was to awaken a vision of what the galaxy could be and to plant the seeds of a philosophy in which loyalty alone might no longer suffice. In the dim light, Horus's consciousness was flooded with visions. The Emperor, whom he had always revered as father and guide, appeared enthroned above a galaxy shackled by absolute rule. Worlds were depicted as oppressed, populations constrained, and the Crusade reframed not as enlightenment, but as silent domination. The images struck at the Warmaster's sense of justice and at his pride in humanity as potential. Betrayal, for the first time, was presented not as sin but as moral necessity, a path to liberation. The illusions were tailored to him. Horus saw himself as a liberator, a savior standing against a divine figure whose dominion, though immense, stifled the growth of humanity. Loyalty was no longer absolute. It was conditional upon the justice and benevolence of the ruler. The whispers of the lodge suggested that defiance could be virtuous, that acts once unimaginable could serve the greater good. The Warmaster's mind, already tended by isolation and the subtle wounds of Da-vin, absorbed these visions with a mixture of awe and conviction, transforming doubt into resolve. Chaos did not coerce him into malevolence. Rather, it presented a galaxy in which rebellion was righteous, framing acts previously considered betrayal as acts of salvation. Pride, love for humanity, and the desire to see mankind flourish, all traits that had once defined Horus's loyalty, were now reframed as instruments of a higher purpose. In this new calculus, disobedience could be sanctified by intent, and moral duty was no longer bound by the dictates of obedience. Emerging from the lodge, Horus bore the same visage of the Warmaster the legions had always revered. Yet beneath the surface, a profound transformation had occurred. Every strategy, every decision, every glance upon the stars now carried the weight of a new philosophy. Freedom and loyalty were not always aligned, and acts that had once been unthinkable could now be construed as moral imperatives. Da-vin and the Serpent Lodge had together forged the crucible of Horus's destiny. The battlefield had tested his flesh, the lodge had tested his spirit. The Warmaster, healed in body and awakened in mind, stood upon the precipice of a choice that would fracture the Imperium. The seeds of the heresy had been planted not through hatred or lust for power, but through conviction, pride, and the subtle manipulations of forces older than the stars themselves. And as he gazed outward, past the darkened halls of the lodge, Horus knew that the path forward was no longer merely obedience. It was a path that would challenge the very foundations of the Imperium, a path where the lines between loyalty and betrayal blurred, and where the Warmaster's destiny would forever alter the course of humanity. Emerging from the shadows of the Serpent Lodge, Horus bore the same visage of the Warmaster that the legions had always revered. Yet beneath the steel and regalia, a new resolve simmered. The visions he had witnessed the Emperor enthroned as a tyrant, the Imperium as a galaxy of shackled worlds had reshaped the Warmaster's mind. Loyalty alone could no longer define duty. The freedom and potential of humanity had become a principle to defend, even if it meant defying the very father he had once worshipped. Returning to the command deck, Horus assessed the legions with a gaze sharpened not merely by strategy but by purpose. Every Astarte, every ship, every maneuver now existed within a broader calculus. How could the Imperium be led in a way that liberated mankind from unseen chains, rather than merely enforcing obedience? The same brilliance that had once orchestrated flawless campaigns now bore the weight of a philosophical awakening. Commands were issued with renewed clarity, calculated to both achieve victory and test the loyalties of those under him, as if probing the fabric of devotion itself. Horus's aides noticed subtle changes. The Warmaster's presence radiated something beyond command, a quiet intensity, a certainty that seemed to hint at truths unspoken. Where once he had measured all actions against the expectations of the Emperor, now he weighed them against an internal vision of justice, freedom, and human potential. The legions followed, oblivious to the philosophical shift guiding their master's decisions, yet sensing in the cadence of his orders a new dimension of purpose. Outside the fleet, planets fell in accordance with his strategies, yet the victories carried a different weight. Each conquest was no longer a mere demonstration of power or obedience, but a subtle testing ground for the ideas implanted within Horus by the Serpent Lodge. Loyalty, courage, and discipline were still honored, but the Warmaster's mind now teetered on the boundary between traditional allegiance and the emergent notion that humanity's liberation might demand acts once considered treachery. As the Great Crusade continued, Horus's internal calculus grew more refined. He scrutinized the Emperor's absence, the policies of the Crusade, and the blind faith of the legions through a lens forged by chaos, not malevolent, but revelatory. He began to see the fractures in the Imperium, the subtle oppression masked by glory and ritual. Where once he would have deferred entirely to the judgment of his father, he now recognized that action, even defiance, could be justified by principle rather than command. Thus, the Warmaster re-emerged from Da-vin and the Serpent Lodge, healed in body, awakened in mind, and burdened with a knowledge that few could comprehend. The seeds of heresy were not yet outwardly visible, but they had taken root. Every decision, every glance across the stars, carried the weight of a nascent rebellion born not from malice, but from conviction. Horus stood poised upon the precipice of destiny, the first of many steps toward a choice that would fracture the Imperium, challenge the bonds of loyalty, and forever alter the fate of humanity. Emerging from the crucible of Da-vin and the Serpent Lodge, Horus carried with him not only wounds and healing, but also the seeds of doubt that chaos had so carefully sown. While the legions continued to see a Warmaster of unparalleled brilliance, the unseen currents that whispered through the warp had already begun to shape his perception. The Chaos God's ancient cunning and inexorably patient operated not through overt domination alone but through the art of suggestion, shaping the choices of mortals and superhuman alike. Horus, despite his grandeur and intellect, became the instrument upon which these forces tested their power. The Serpent Lodge's rituals were subtle in execution yet profound in consequence. Each incantation, each visual hallucination of oppression and tyranny, was tailored to Horus's mind. The Emperor, depicted in visions as an omnipotent figure enthroned above humanity, became the focus of moral scrutiny rather than unquestioned reverence. Entire planets, supposedly free under the banner of the Imperium, were shown as oppressed, shackled by the decrees of a distant and remote ruler. The Warmaster's pride, his love of humanity, and his desire for true justice were gently but irresistibly manipulated. Betrayal was reframed as necessity, disobedience as moral imperative. Chaos, in this sense, did not corrupt Horus's values. It redirected them toward a vision in which rebellion became righteous. This was the path by which the Warmaster was betrayed. Not by the flaws of character, nor by overt coercion, but by suggestion and illusion. The warp, eternal and inconstant, revealed to him a universe in which loyalty to the Emperor could conflict with the greater good. The subtle manipulations exploited the fissures already formed in Horus's psyche during the isolation of the Great Crusade. The absence of the Emperor and the mounting tensions among the Primarchs' doubts, once private and fleeting, became justification for revolutionary action. Every whisper of chaos reinforced the notion that the Warmaster's role could transcend obedience, that humanity could only flourish if liberated from the shadow of a paternal figure perceived as tyrant. Yet, even within this manipulation lay a kernel of truth. The Emperor had indeed withdrawn to Dera to construct the Webway project, a secretive endeavor intended to grant humanity a shield against the predations of the warp. His absence, while tactically and philosophically motivated, appeared as abandonment to Horus. From the perspective of the legions, it was loyalty to a distant father. From the perspective of the Warmaster, it became an absence pregnant with neglect. Chaos's illusions exploited this gap, presenting not just what was false but what felt true, magnifying natural suspicions and framing them as moral dilemmas. The effect was compounded by the social and political pressures surrounding Horus. The other Primarchs were ambitious, some obstinate offered subtle provocations, or openly challenged his authority. Perturbo's cold calculations, Russ's uncompromising judgment, Lorgar's zeal for faith, they all contributed, wittingly or not, to a sense of isolation. Horus, aware of his unprecedented authority as Warmaster, perceived the expectations of the Imperium as both adulation and constraint. The seeds of betrayal did not sprout from malice, but from a convergence of personal pride, love for humanity, and the insidious whispers of chaos. As historians and scholars have debated, Chaos's intervention was neither simplistic nor wholly external. The Warmaster's own virtues, his pride, loyalty, and moral rigor, were the very qualities exploited to turn him against his father. To claim that Horus was merely a puppet denies the depth of his intellect. Yet to ignore the profound influence of warp manipulation is to misunderstand the mechanics of the heresy. In this reading, Horus was betrayed by forces both internal and external, a tragedy orchestrated across psychological, spiritual, and cosmic planes. The legacy of lies and the heresy can be observed in the actions that followed. Horus's decisions, while appearing deliberate, were deeply informed by the visions granted to him by chaos. Every campaign, every subtle manipulation of allies and legions, carried the echo of the large and the whispers of gods who existed beyond mortal comprehension. Betrayal was not instantaneous. It was cumulative, the result of carefully constructed illusions that appealed to the very core of the Warmaster's identity. Thus, within the framework of lies, Horus's fall was a narrative of tragic inevitability. The Warmaster, brilliant, proud, and moral in intent, was nudged by powers unseen into a course that would fracture the Imperium. His actions were the product of cunningly crafted perceptions, his rebellion framed as moral and necessary. In the historical records, Chaos's manipulation is evident not as overt domination, but as the strategic orchestration of doubt, perception, and moral framing, exploiting both opportunity and virtue to achieve a cosmic objective. While Chaos sought to shape Horus through illusions and moral seduction, another layer of reality persisted beneath the veneer of deception. In the annals of the Great Crusade, there were truths the Emperor had deliberately concealed, truths that, once glimpsed, complicated the narrative of simple betrayal. Horus, despite the manipulations of the warp, may have discerned elements of these hidden realities. Adding nuance to the question, did he fall purely to lies, or had he also recognized aspects of the truth? The Emperor's retreat to Dera, while a tactical necessity for the Webway project, was not the sole secret. The Warmaster may have been aware of only partially of the Emperor's past experiments with the Thunder Warriors, the precursors to the Astartes, designed as instruments of war rather than beings of moral agency. These warriors, though effective in battle, represented a pattern of pragmatism and ruthlessness that the Emperor carried into the Crusade, enforcing obedience and crushing dissent with absolute efficiency. For Horus, whose moral compass and sense of justice were finely tuned, Such revelations could have confirmed suspicions that the emperor's vision of humanity, while noble in goal, relied upon mechanisms of control that bordered on tyranny. Furthermore, the emperor's suppression of organized religion during the Crusade, while intended to prevent the rise of chaos worship and maintain ideological unity, may have appeared to the Warmaster as the denial of freedom itself. Entire populations were guided not merely by law but by an imposition of belief or the enforced absence of it, leaving Horus to question whether the Imperium's apparent enlightenment masked a form of spiritual despotism. The Crusade's brutal efficiency, the relentless enforcement of obedience, and the occasional extermination of worlds deemed non-compliant, these actions could in Horus's eyes validate the whispers of the Serpent Lodge, that unchecked authority even in the hands of the emperor could become oppressive. In this light, some historians argue that Horus was not entirely the victim of chaos, but a discerning observer who recognized the inconsistencies and moral compromises of the Imperium. The moral tension was acute. The father he revered was also a figure capable of acts that violated the principles Horus held dear. To disobey, therefore, may have appeared not as betrayal, but as adherence to a higher standard, a form of moral and philosophical reasoning that transcended mere loyalty. The lore provides multiple accounts of Horus's state of mind in this period. Certain novels and fan interpretations suggest that he retained the clarity to perceive the emperor's fallibility, even while under the influence of chaos. Some even posit that the Warmaster calculated his path, weighing the potential for humanity's growth against the cost of personal allegiance. Was he, then, a revolutionary guided by conscience as much as by external manipulation? Or were these retrospective interpretations attempts to rationalize a fall otherwise explained by deception and cosmic influence? Debates among scholars highlight the complexity of this question. In some texts, Horus's decisions are framed as strategic, conscious, and informed by the emperor's hidden truths. In others, the warp's manipulations are emphasized, portraying him as a tragic victim swayed by visions crafted to exploit his virtues. Both perspectives intersect. The Warmaster's pride, intelligence, and love for humanity made him capable of perceiving systemic flaws in the Imperium. Simultaneously, chaos ensured that these perceptions were amplified, contextualized, and weaponized. The distinction between lies and truth becomes blurred, suggesting that the heresy was not merely an act of rebellion, but a confluence of insight, conviction, and manipulation. Moreover, the narrative of truth challenges the assumption that loyalty is inherently virtuous. Horus, in discerning the emperor's concealments, the pragmatic ruthlessness, the historical silences, the selective enforcement of obedience, may have recognized that absolute loyalty could perpetuate systemic injustice. The Warmaster's actions, viewed through this lens, were morally coherent within his framework. If the Imperium's foundation relied upon deception and control, then defiance was not sin, but a pursuit of a different ideal. This duality, being simultaneously misled and aware, creates the enduring debate around Horus's fall. The Warmaster embodies both the tragic victim of chaos, its intricate manipulation, and the discerning mind that glimpsed inconvenient truths. The heresy, therefore, is not a narrative of binary morality. It is a tragedy of conflicting imperatives, of loyalty clashing with conscience, and of a galaxy caught between cosmic deception and human insight. In conclusion, the truth perspective suggests that Horus's betrayal cannot be reduced to simple corruption. Instead, it encompasses the recognition of hidden realities, the evaluation of moral principles, and the choice to act upon them even when such action meant opposing the father he revered. Lies and truth intertwined, creating a tapestry in which the Warmaster's fall was neither entirely engineered nor entirely autonomous. It was, in every sense, the tragedy of a mind capable of seeing beyond the surface, yet ensnared by forces beyond comprehension. With the Warmaster's mind irrevocably altered, torn between the manipulations of chaos and glimpses of hidden truths, the galaxy teetered on the brink. The legions, once united under the banners of the Emperor, now faced the subtle fractures sown in the minds of their Primarch. Horus, guided by a conviction that defiance might serve the greater good, turned his formidable intellect and authority toward rebellion. The first sparks of the Horus Heresy ignited in the shadows, not as a sudden betrayal, but as the culmination of years of subtle manipulation, ideological tension, and philosophical awakening. The initial campaigns of the heresy were swift and devastating. Worlds once pledged in loyalty fell under unexpected assault, their defenders caught unaware by the precision and foresight of a Warmaster who had mastered both strategy and perception. The legions themselves were divided, some remaining loyal to the Emperor, others swayed by Horus's charisma and the ethical imperative he now embraced. Each battle, each world subjugated further, entrenched the sense of fracture, and with every death toll mounting into the billions, the Imperium began to resemble less a united empire and more a galaxy of warring states under the shadow of a single fractured command. The Primarchs' loyalties, already complex and varied, became pivotal. Some, like Lorgar and Angron, aligned with Horus, drawn by personal grievances or philosophical resonance. Others, such as Rogel Dorn and Lionel John, remained staunchly loyal to the Emperor. These divisions were more than tactical. They represented ideological schisms within the Imperium, fracturing the unity that had allowed the Great Crusade to expand so rapidly. The galaxy, once a canvas of imperial expansion, became a theater of tragedy. Every star system occupied, every legion commanded, was now a potential battleground in a civil war that threatened to unravel millennia of conquest. Horrors unfolded as entire populations became collateral in campaigns between brothers. Worlds burned, cities crumbled, and billions perished. Yet the heresy was not merely physical destruction, it was the corruption of ideals, the twisting of once sacred oaths, and the erosion of faith in the permanence of order. The Warmaster's vision, however flawed or manipulated, gave a moral veneer to actions that otherwise would have seemed indefensible. Soldiers and citizens alike struggled to reconcile the grandeur of the Imperium with the stark reality of war, and in doing so, the galaxy began its descent into the grimdark era that would define the 31st millennium. The subtle, strategic brilliance of Horus made him a force unlike any other. Even against loyalist forces, his campaigns combined tactical genius with psychological insight, exploiting hesitation, ambition, and doubt among his opponents. Each victory, however, carried a cost. The further the Warmaster advanced, the more irreversible the rifts within the Imperium became. Chaos, ever watchful, ensured that Horus's genius served both his conscience and the inexorable will of the warp, intertwining moral choice and cosmic manipulation. By the time the heresy was recognized in its full scope, entire sectors had already fallen, and the Imperium teetered on the edge of collapse. The heresy reached its crescendo at Dera, where the Warmaster faced the father he had once revered. Fleets of ships darkened orbital skies, and the legions of both loyalist and traitor Primarchs clashed across orbital platforms, cityscapes, and the ruins of what was once the heart of human civilization. The siege of Dera was not merely a battle of armies. It was a confrontation of ideals, wills, and fates, a war that mirrored the tragedy of Horus's own mind. Within the walls of the imperial palace, the Emperor, wounded, resolute, yet undiminished in majesty, stood as the final bulwark of humanity. Horus, once his favored son, now approached not as ally but as challenger, a Warmaster driven by conviction, illusion, and revelation. Their confrontation was monumental, the clash of superhuman strength and intellect reverberating across the palace. Each strike, each command, carried the weight of billions, and the outcome would determine not only the fate of the Dera system but of the Imperium itself. In the end, Horus fell. His body broken, his spirit extinguished, he became the tragic fulcrum upon which the galaxy balanced. The Emperor, grievously wounded in the confrontation, was interred upon the Golden Throne, a device of life support and psychic amplification that preserved the Emperor in a state of perpetual near-death. From this throne, the Emperor would guide humanity, not through active command, but through the reverent faith and ritual of the Imperium, a realm sustained as much by devotion as by bionic engineering. The aftermath of the siege was catastrophic. Entire worlds had been leveled, entire sectors depopulated. Primarchs were scattered, some dead, some in self-imposed exile, and the legions that had once epitomized unity now bore the scars of civil war. Billions of souls were lost, and the Imperium, while surviving, had become a shadow of its former glory. The central authority, once embodied in the living Emperor, was now mediated through bureaucracy, dogma, and the machinery of the Adeptus Terra. Faith became the glue holding shattered systems together, and violence became both the language and the law of the galaxy. In this grim aftermath, the heresy left indelible marks on history and psyche alike. Humanity survived, but at the cost of innocence, unity, and certainty. The Imperium endured as a decaying colossus, a state defined by ritual, obedience, and the ever-present shadow of chaos. The Golden Throne, a monument to both triumph and tragedy, became the axis around which civilization turned, a silent reminder of the confrontation between father and son, loyalty and conviction, truth and deception. The siege of Dera illustrates the paradox at the heart of Horus's rebellion. A Primarch manipulated yet perceptive, capable of extraordinary insight yet ensnared by cosmic forces beyond comprehension. The galaxy was left irrevocably altered. The consequences of the heresy were encoded into the very structures of human civilization. Endless wars to suppress rebellion, a rigid hierarchy to enforce obedience, and a culture in which faith, violence, and survival were inseparable. Ultimately, the heresy codified the grimdark nature of the 31st millennium. Horus's death, the Emperor's immolation upon the Golden Throne, and the decimated Imperium became eternal symbols of tragedy and endurance. The galaxy, vast and silent in the cold reaches of space, bore witness to the consequences of choices made in doubt, ambition, and manipulated perception. Every star, every world, every surviving soul carried the legacy of a war that had fractured not just armies, but ideals, families, and the very conception of humanity itself. As the Horus Heresy drew to a close in the 31st millennium, one question lingered in the minds of historians and survivors alike. Did Horus betray the Emperor because he was deceived by chaos, or because he truly saw truths that others could not? There is no simple answer. Accounts from loyalists and traitors alike often conflict. Some depict Horus as a pawn, others as a figure who glimpsed the flaws of the Imperium and acted accordingly. This uncertainty captures the essence of this grimdark galaxy. Warhammer 40k is not a universe of clear heroes and villains. It is a history of tragedy, where conviction, ambition, loyalty, and betrayal are tangled together. Horus's actions cannot be judged as purely evil or righteous. They lie in the gray area where human ambition, Primarch pride, and cosmic manipulation intersect, with consequences that shaped the galaxy for millennia. The father-son bond between the Emperor and Horus adds even more weight to the story. Their relationship, forged through campaigns of the Great Crusade, was strong yet fragile. Absence, miscommunication, and the seduction of chaos strained it to breaking. Horus, once the favored son and Warmaster, became both instrument and victim of powers beyond his control. The tragedy is not just in the galaxy-wide civil war, but in the personal betrayal, the heartache of a son turning against a father. The heresy left the galaxy forever changed. Worlds were destroyed, civilizations shattered, and Primarchs scattered. The Emperor, confined to the Golden Throne, could no longer lead actively, and humanity survived at great cost. The Imperium endured, but it was a hollowed-out empire sustained by faith, violence, and strict ritual. Its survival depended on obedience, bureaucracy, and the unyielding belief of billions, a stark reflection of the price paid for Horus's rebellion. The story of Horus and the Emperor shows that morality is rarely absolute. Heroes may betray, villains may act from conviction, and loyalty often conflicts with ambition. The rebellion, catastrophic though it was, emerged from choices shaped by secrecy, personal pride, and cosmic forces. Understanding these events fully is impossible, and that uncertainty is at the heart of the grimdark philosophy. For historians, chroniclers, and survivors, the Horus Heresy offers lessons about the limits of understanding. It forces reflection on the motives of individuals caught within structures far larger than themselves. The story does not provide clear verdicts. It records events, motives, and outcomes, leaving interpretation to those who study it. This mirrors the Imperium itself, complex, flawed, and sustained by belief as much as by force. Ultimately, the tale of Horus and the Emperor is both a warning and a meditation. Decisions made in doubt, ambition, or manipulation have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Betrayal and loyalty, truth and deception, vision and manipulation all coexist within a tapestry too vast for simple judgment. The Horus Heresy is not just history, it is philosophy, a tragedy of cosmic scale, and a reminder of the human cost in a galaxy defined by war. Was Horus truly deceived, or did he act upon truths hidden from all others? The answer remains unknown, and the 31st millennium holds only the consequences of his choices.